I'm Jacque Van Houten. I'm working currently at the Jefferson County Public Schools as a world language consultant and specialist in the K-12 district. I spent the previous 14 years at the Kentucky Department of Education and have taught anywhere from middle school through university, language and education, teacher education programs. So I'd like to get a feel for you too. So how many of you are K-12 teachers? Okay. University professors? Okay. State or federal government people? Okay. And anybody else that want to tell me what you are if I'm missing? I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Okay. Great. Okay. And your programs, how many are Chinese? Okay, Arabic? Hindi? Okay, what else am I missing? Russian. Okay, great. Portuguese. Good. Okay, fabulous. Okay, so, and last question, how many of you have had previous programs versus a first time? Okay, and for how many of you is it a first time program? Okay, and so today what we're going to talk about is embedding interculturality into your STARTALK programs. I know that you have dealt with this in the past if you've had programs. I think you have a basic understanding, but we're not going to take anything for granted. So I think by the end of today, I'd like for you to be able to define interculturality, but not just among yourselves in the room, but to define it to the stakeholders so that you could explain it to the learners that you're dealing with.
I'm not going to cut too long into this, but I'll just make reference to two documents that have been out there that have been talking for about the last 10 years about it. One actually didn't talk about intercultural, it was talking about transcultural competence, and that was the MLA ad hoc committee report from 2007. And if you want to know where that is, if you haven't heard of that before, I can point you in that direction, because that talks about the moving between cultures, basically being a cultural broker. The other more recent one is the one that came out of the Interagency Language Roundtable, which we developed a series of descriptions for competence in intercultural communication. So we're now, unfortunately, once you come out with documents like that, the first question people have, particularly on the government level, is, well, where's your test for testing for intercultural competence? And we have to keep telling them it's not just about making a test, it's about coming up with standards, and different entities are going to develop different sorts of frameworks for assessing that.
Good. Can't come up with a multiple choice test for that?
No, we're not there yet.
Good. Well, never. Maybe.
We'll get back to you next year about that.
Okay, good.
So we were talking about how there's such a push for language proficiency, and we have a solid idea of like what the rules of language are, and what sounds right or doesn't sound right, and that, like, as was alluded to, the idea of interculturality is a little bit newer, but also in the sense that you can't just have the language proficiency, like you know what sounds wrong and right linguistically, but maybe culturally, in a form of a greeting or how a certain exchange should go. There's also that sense of like, oh, this is how we do it, or this is not how we do it, and the idea of also giving that importance in the classroom and not just the language side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're certainly on track with that. And I think the challenge there comes to who's the we. This is how we do it. Who is that we in that group? Because in any language group, in any culture, there are multiple we's. So trying to decide who the other is, if there needs to be another, or are we all others? How we fit into all cultures, in other words. Well, I think you're all really on track, and you are sounding so knowledgeable compared to where we started with STARTALK years ago in terms of the language, but also the interculturality aspect. This is really great. And we're evolving. All of this is an evolution, including the national standards for language, the world readiness standards. Our standards have changed over the years. And I'm going to put up some examples from the culture goal in the standards, and I'd like you to think about how things are similar with the past, how they're different, what's new, and what the real message is we're trying to get across today. So in 1996, the standards for culture said, gain knowledge and understanding of other cultures. And the goal now is interact with cultural competence and understanding. So how have things evolved? How have things changed? What do you see there that's similar, different, or?
It's changed from passive to active.
Yeah, from passive to active, to participatory, to getting into the usage, yes. Anything else? Mm-hmm.
It's less of an approach that says that culture is something that you can learn about, but culture is something that is part of your total language competence, because you're never going to be monocultural by virtue of the fact that if you're a world language or foreign language learner, you're always going to be coming from some other language and culture, so you're going to have to move between minimally to, and hopefully, if you keep at it for long enough, 3 or 4 or 5 other languages and cultures.
Right, so you become a negotiator.
It is. It's a cultural broker, if you will, or a cultural negotiator.
It is. Anything?
And
Mm-hmm.
the purpose of understanding here is to achieve a performance, which is the action,
Right.
versus just gaining the knowledge.
Right. You still have to have the knowledge, you still have to have the understanding, but it's what you do with it. And it's setting a real purpose for gaining that knowledge and that understanding.
Knowledge how to.
Yes, exactly. Anything the same? Mm-hmm. Yes, sir?
Okay, what I see here is actually going from multicultural into monocultural, because you cannot live in a new culture with your own cultural knowledge and background. To gain knowledge and understanding other cultures, you can use your own language, you can use your mother tongue to know about other languages. But once you live in another culture, interact with cultural competence and understanding, you have to use that culture, use that language. It becomes monocultural and monolingual.
Right. Or even going beyond into plurilingual and pluricultural. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that sense of plurilingual and pluricultural in learning a language and knowing how to interact in a culture at different levels for different purposes. So that if you are just wanting to know a culture for a certain experience, a short time experience, you need some language, you need some culture, that is at a different level than if you are taking a job in a new country or learning a language to teach that language. Okay, so now let's take a look at the goals again from 1996, the specific standards within the goal. Students demonstrate an understanding of the relationship between practices and perspectives. The 2 P's there. And then today, relating cultural practice to perspectives, using that language to, active words, investigate, explain, and reflect on the relationships. So what's the message here? How have things changed?
You really see it, this is really coming within the context of the deeper knowledge framework of, analyze, synthesize, which is all the understanding piece, but there's that application piece is running through all of this. The idea of investigating, really reflecting, and of developing a practice, you could say negotiating, but really getting beyond, the application has to happen, it's not just enough to do the first 2, you understand?
And I sense a little bit less of me and other. More of we're all in this. Yeah. Anyone else? And then with the others, students demonstrate and understand the relationship between the products and the perspectives. And then basically the same thing, going from the practices, the behaviors, to the products, being literature, systems, music, dance, rituals. And so again, that whole idea of interaction, participatory sense in the culture, which to me seems to send a message of responsibility. Responsibility on the learner's part to become involved. Responsibility on the teacher's part to provide opportunities for interaction. And that's challenging. We challenge ourselves all the time as teachers. We've made an evolution here from the language from learning about the language to learning to use the language functionally, going to the communicative perspective, going to what the students can do, the student perspective, to now the same thing in the cultural aspect, going to what the students can do with language and putting it sometimes with an I can perspective, making it the responsibility of the student. So we've got from the past those 3 Ps, the practices, the products, and the perspectives. We still have the meanings, the values that underlie why we have certain practices, or which have helped to determine those practices, and which have created those products, or which change the attitudes because of the products. They're all interrelated still, but now they're embedded within the language with interculturality. It's all of it all together. And so where does this put that, as we used to say, Taco Tuesday, the Food Friday or whatever. We can't have that culture separate from the language teaching. It has to be embedded, has to be integrated. Again, we went through the process of learning how learning language is important when it's meaningful. Same thing with the culture. It has to be meaningful. It can't be just learning about something. It becomes more meaningful when you're actually involved in it. So not teaching so much about. So then the definition of interculturality. Talk at your table for a minute. How do you define it? Because you have to define it to stakeholders. When parents in your group or when other teachers in your group are dealing with the child's progress in what they're learning in the program, you need to be able to explain to the parent what they're doing with interculturality, why there is perhaps a note about the progress of the child's interculturality, or explaining to the child what it is that you're trying to do. So talk about a definition that you might use.
It's just a part of everything that you don't even think about it being different. So, as a language learner myself, that was, like she said, it was every Friday we'd have Russian food, or we'd go and we'd learn about the culture in a separate setting in English, and then you'd go back to your classroom and learn how to speak it. So they never really connected. Yes.
Actually, it started with the greeting, very basic. Greetings, definitely. Yeah, it's definitely related to culture.
And as we're learning greetings, to demonstrate that, where the interculturality is.
Yes.
And I think then if you start from day one with those greetings and not use the word simple because it can be complicated, right? And really let the student feel like they've learned something beyond how to say hello, but how to say hello.
And do you think it helps, though, to contrast between the culture that you're currently in and the one you're learning, or do you think that causes more confusion? Like you mentioned when you're reading an article, say about a robbery or something, how the language, the country you're reading about treats it differently than say they do here. Do you think that helps as instructors?
I think we do that all the time, compare and contrast, right, in our teaching. Because, if they have already had the prior knowledge about greetings in English, it would be easier for them to learn another language, but maybe the culture is a little bit different. So I think it's important to constantly compare and contrast. I do that all the time.
But students naturally do that, though.
Yeah.
When they see something different, they say,
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
on our neighborhood or our family or whatever.
So the food you are going to use popular
What are
American
some
food,
of
and then
the
the food in
things
China.
that you
Right.
talked about? How do you find that you can explain this to your stakeholders? Because this is really important. You become a PR person for language and sharing with others how language is learned today. And how you're preparing that global professional for tomorrow and how that differs from what those parents or those administrators may have experienced in the past. So this is really helpful to think about how you're going to explain it.
I think that in our table, one point that came up is using jargon can be off-putting, depending on who are you trying to convey the message. So this is something that we need to be aware of. We tend to use a lot of jargon with our colleagues in the profession, but we're explaining it to someone who's not in the field, then we really have to be conscious about how we use that.
And I'll take that before we take more comments to show you, take the opportunity to show you the definition that STARTALK gives in Lingual Folio Junior, which may not be something you want to use. It may be still too jargony, but the way it's defined for Lingual Folio Junior is a dynamic process of active participation in communication guided by an awareness of understanding of culture. Okay, now that still may be too jargony for certainly for a child, but even for a parent, you may want to explain it some other way.
The way that it was termed is that this interculturality is really essential when you're talking about what Ron Walton called the truly foreign languages, and I'm talking about the really less commonly taught Chinese, Japanese, but Arabic as well. And the analogy I always use is I will never be confused for being being Chinese. I mean, as long as people can see my face, I will never be confused for being a Chinese. And you can substitute your own language as well. And so the point is that my ability to transition between my culture and a very broad, and I'm not saying it's a single culture, but a Chinese culture, becomes very, very essential. That in order to, as you were saying to the stakeholders, they have to understand that I will understand things about learning Chinese as a foreign language that the native speaker will not understand, but by the same token, the native speaker will understand things that I will never understand. Of course, in a mercenary manner, would say that really justifies why you want to have at least 2 teachers that you hire instead of 1. You want to hire your native speaker and your non-native speaker because together they can bring in what it means to be acting interculturally.
We were talking a little bit about the fact that, particularly with young children, right, we have not been exposed to lots of different countries, etc. Is that, I like this word awareness. The awareness shift is that culture, we often think of it as something that other people have. You know, we don't have culture. It's something other people have, and that's that passive, I'm going to understand your culture. But this dynamic process, it's really, you can't make meaning in a context unless you recognize that, in fact, you have a culture personally as part of my personal identity, and then I have to step into your shoes. And so it's a deep awareness. It really restructures our personal identity in a lot of ways because we understand our own culture. We have to understand our own culture in relationship to those cultures that we may be less aware of.
Yeah, which often makes me think, we know language is political. And we know there are certain groups that would rather have us not learn language because that suggests we're going to learn how to do things in other ways. But in essence, we do learn more about our own culture, which sometimes will lead us to do things in different ways. But you know, it does give us a deep understanding of who we are and what our background is and why we do certain things and believe certain things. And it can start at a very young age because you're right, children don't understand they have a culture. Even a lot of adults don't recognize it.
Background knowledge and we don't often are aware of the background information that helps us make meaning. We take it for granted, and if we start to make meaning in a language that's not our first, then we really have to understand the background that structures the meanings in that context.
Anyone else? Okay. You had mentioned earlier about the Interagency Language Roundtable, and with the evolution of language, we have come a long way in developing how we look at and assess language. The cultural assessment is very, very new. But we go back to when, in the early days, looking at the language through the government perspective, when we had experiences in Japan and Korea and realized we didn't have a lot of people who knew the language or the culture, and we had to figure out a way to evaluate what people knew, that there was a scale earlier that looked at language and is still used through the government. And I don't know if you want to expand on that at all.
It started out very much focusing only on the language. So in other words, the initial, what are called the skill level descriptions, focused on the traditional four modalities: listening, reading, speaking, and listening. And then what emerged more recently, for vocational reasons, we developed a set of not proficiency levels, but competency levels for translation and interpretation, because we recognize those are very important parts of the government work. And then more recently, this notion of competence. And again, we're not saying cultural proficiency, we're not talking cultural performance, we're talking about cultural competence in a parallel set of numerical rating number levels going from 0 up to 5.
And the idea too of not just the cultural knowledge, but with the language, what can you do at certain levels?
It's not like as actual, we were talking earlier at the table, you may remember in the 80s when ACTFL first introduced the 4 traditional modalities, speaking, listening, reading, writing, there was a 5th set of levels for culture, and I think they had them out there maybe 6 months, and they yanked them back in because it was such a hot potato, and it engendered such hostility that they just said we can't go there. And I think part of the reason why intercultural is better, because you talking about cultural proficiency probably isn't the best way to think about it, because for a language learner, you're not developing cultural competence so much as intercultural competence.
Right, and I think we're bantering those terms in language as well. We're looking at proficiency and competency too. We're all looking for global competence and trying to figure out what that means, and having some groups tell us it's not necessarily, you don't need language for that.
It's not a short discussion. That working group out of the ILR spent a good 3 years coming up with the intercultural, and some of it just rested upon, are we going to call it proficiency, or are we going to call it performance, and ultimately competence was sort of the compromise, that we don't talk about cultural proficiency, we don't talk about cultural performance, although you are performing.
Because when are you proficient? I mean, you may be proficient for certain tasks, for certain purposes, but proficiency it's challenging.
Linguistic proficiency in a way that you can't talk about quote unquote cultural proficiency.
And even with language, I think you get into some gray areas too. So if we go then to the ACTFL scale, which I presume everyone is familiar with the levels of novice, intermediate, advanced, and beyond, and then the sub-levels of low, mid, and high. We know that today when we're looking at a learner's proficiency in language, or even what they can do in terms of competence with language, we're looking at it in terms of these sub-levels, so that we know that you can't create with language until you're at that intermediate level. And we're becoming very knowledgeable about what to expect of a new learner. So a new learner coming in, just dealing with phrases, just dealing maybe with words, not being able to express themselves, just having rote memory come out for responses, not being able to ask and answer questions until maybe that intermediate level, or at least the novice high, and still they're memorized. Only talking about self, it's a challenge to get them from one level to the next. It takes time, but we need to know what to expect at certain levels of language. And remember, we're talking about interculturality. So language is part of interculturality. We need to understand both sides of it. And I think what may help in explaining to maybe your parents and your other stakeholders would be a visual such as this, where you've got that overlap, where you have the language proficiency, your ability to use language functionally in a setting, and then to use the cultural knowledge. And when they come together at that novice level, it's really very slim. You're really only knowing in terms of identification and recognition, and your usage of things is almost a memorized usage, that you know that you should bow, or that you should shake hands, or that you should give cheek kisses. You know what you should do in certain instances, maybe not all the time with every person, but you have some recognition that you ought to be doing something. And then when you get to the intermediate level, there's a greater crossover. Here now you're creating with language. You're able to express your own thoughts. You're able to understand that the other has some of their own thoughts. You're recognizing what is global, and you're recognizing perhaps what is considered stereotypical, and thinking that that is stereotypical. Beginning to come to a realization that there is a stereotype and what that means. That it may have some basis because a lot of people do it, but it doesn't mean everybody does it. And recognizing what those behaviors and those products are. And then able to imitate some of those, and then maybe not just imitate, maybe use them in an appropriate sense. And then advanced, obviously you're using that knowledge of the language to begin to negotiate situations in some complicated situations, but familiar in terms of world familiarity or your own personal interest. You can deal with a larger sense of topic, a larger group of audience with some formal and informal language. And with that brings a greater knowledge of that interculturality. Now, can you develop language without interculturality? Yeah. But how effective are you going to be? Yeah. And the same thing. You can read all about culture and then know very little about language. And again, how effective are you going to be? You're much more effective if you have a competence in both of them. So we look at how this happens with the superior, with the distinguished, and notice again, even with that distinguished, you're not the other. There may always be something that is not understood or not be able to be put into practice. So a realization of that, I think, is important. And showing those parents that novice level and the intermediate level where your learners may be is very important for their expectations. You know, I think we're beyond that, well, maybe not quite, but we're getting really beyond the fluency idea. We're not using that word so much, and parents are not necessarily expecting it. And we want to make it realistic. So this is an idea for showing them what interculturality means. We've based most of our ideas on interculturality from Byram's model of intercultural communicative competence. And coming from the 5 kinds of knowledge, he talks about attitudes. And this is the attitude of curiosity, of being open, being ready to accept that there may be differences, not necessarily knowing what they are, but just ready to think that there could be differences. And then knowledge of social groups, that there are different people out there and how they interact with each other, and beginning to take some participatory stance in that. A knowledge of interpreting and relating, interpreting documents, interpreting actions, and then relating them to your own, and thinking how there is a comparison or a difference, and that's a beginning of negotiation. Even if it's looking at a document and trying to figure out what it means, you're negotiating with what you know and then thinking about what the other culture knows and how they think, and so you begin to come to terms with things. And then a knowledge of discovery and interaction, willingness to go out there and try, and you're trying to use your cultural knowledge with the language, you're interacting with other people, you're coming to a sense of what you need to do in certain instances, how you need to use language and express yourself in a culturally appropriate way. And then your critical awareness, where you begin to have some judgments about what you're doing, what others are doing, and how that really gives a depth of understanding of the culture, why people do the things that they do, why they make the choices, the cultural choices that they make. So we think of it as feeling, knowing, and acting. And those are the terms that are used in the Lingual Folio Junior to make it more comprehensible to young learners particularly. I'm going to play a video clip now from Michael Byram as he talks about interculturality. He is a professor at Durham University. He has been working with interculturality for a long time. He's worked with NACESFL, the state supervisors. He's worked with professors at the University of Connecticut. He has been able to give some professional development in DC and other places. And he knows what we're dealing with, but he comes to it from a European perspective and a long time dealing with this this communicative mode of dealing with culture.
We always say, as teachers and as policymakers, that learning foreign languages isn't just a matter of learning to communicate, but also that it has an influence on people, that they become more tolerant, that they have more understanding of other countries and people. My research, therefore, began to turn around, where we showed that, in fact, foreign language teaching, which focuses only on skills, doesn't inevitably lead to increase in tolerance or increase in understanding at all. And therefore, I have spent the last 20 or more years trying to persuade, as it were, that we need to be more systematic in foreign language teaching towards what has now become called intercultural education. Culture is, as someone said, one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in English. And I think you could probably say that about any language, that the equivalent word in any language is extremely complex. My way of approaching this has been to say culture is a matter of people's knowledge, beliefs and behaviours. What one does is culture. Indeed, one person once said that culture is a verb. It's not a noun, it's what people do. But behind what they do is what they know and what they believe in and the values that they attach to what they do. Often said that culture is what other people have, that we don't have culture, what we have is just what we have. But babies, as we know, and little children, as we know, are very curious. They're always asking questions. They get answers, they observe, they see people, they imitate. So over time, it becomes natural to them. We have the phrase, it becomes second nature. And I think that's an interesting phrase because because of the way which we take all this to be natural. And as I said, it's other people who have culture. And it's only when you meet other people or go to another place that you too have culture, because people start asking you those questions again. What we need to do then, I think, is learn how to ask those questions again in the way that we learnt about the world through asking questions when we were little. It's a question, first of all, of noticing. When, first of all, one notices and something strikes you in a conversation or in an interaction of any kind, and you notice something. Now, often people attribute what's going wrong to personality. Therefore, the next step is this notion of asking questions in the nicest and politest way possible, of course, but to ask about what people are doing or thinking when something has gone wrong. What do you normally do? What happens in your country, etc.? That kind of approach is important. And then the same issue, but with respect to oneself, asking questions as if one were that other person, as it were. Well, why am I doing what I'm doing? What is it that I'm doing which might be misunderstood by the other person? Which then hopefully will lead to some better self-understanding, and not assuming that it's always a question of understanding others, but of understanding how other people see us.
Okay, so the noticing and the asking questions. Now, his notion that you only experience that real growth when you are put in that position, in that other environment, poses a problem for STARTALK programs, for classroom programs in general. At least it's a slight challenge I think we have to think about. You know, how are we going to make intercultural opportunities for our students, because we can't take them necessarily to the country of origin of the language or the culture. We have to figure out how we can do it within the classroom. And the noticing is the first thing. There can be native speakers that you can bring in that are maybe teachers, that may be visitors to the class, that could be Skyped in, that could be videos that you show for in the beginning. But that noticing has to have a little push. It's the responsibility of the teachers in the program to get the kids to think about noticing, because they may be noticing unconsciously, but until they think about what they're seeing, it's not going to embed those ideas into their thinking. You have a statement? Oh, sorry. Okay. So, think about this. Think too, and at your tables, try to answer these questions. Where do learners encounter culture, formally or informally? And think in terms of that STARTALK program, and how do they know its culture? And how do they express that knowledge in the target language?
When they observe the difference or the distinction consistently, it appears and then reappears, then they say, oh, they are doing it as a way, as a cultural way. So that's when they encounter culture.
Informally, when they go to Chinese restaurant, they definitely notice the difference. Right?
So they notice the difference. Everybody is using chopsticks. Yeah.
It's almost, as soon as you label it as culture, it becomes difficult to capture. Like, it's almost like if a student's told, oh, we're going to learn about culture. It's like almost kind of like with math. When you learn math is hard, so then you start to not, as you get older, oh, it's hard, so I can't do it. I think culture has that same connotation.
And I think now, if we're going to have learners discover culture rather than having your Cultural Friday thing where you can switch into English, it has to be through thematic units, natural teaching and learning. I'm thinking about, in my Russian 1 class at the end of last year, we learned the calendar and the days of the week, and I didn't say a whole lot, but we put out a lot of Russian calendars, and then all of a sudden, and as the students were saying on what day they're going to do something, all of a sudden somebody asked the question, hey, the first day of the week on the Russian calendar is Monday, ours is Sunday. So I never said, okay, we're going to have calendar culture, right?
Discovery.
But it was letting them discover it, and then saying, wow, let's look at the names of the days of the week, and what do they mean, and do they have meaning in Russian?
Why is it different?
And did they ever think about what the day of the week meant in English then? It's a discovery for both cultures then. And that's where you can get into some comparison. But I think it is giving them those opportunities to have that discovery through thematic units, taking everything we're learning and putting it all together, and it will happen.
Yeah, for novice level, it's difficult to explain why. Right? You can just show them.
And so maybe you don't actually be the person to show to. You give them the tools and you give them the opportunity. And I think for us many lessons went by, and I have to sit patiently because I know, right? And it's very hard when you want to hand out the calendar and say, oh, and look at this, But it's very hard. You have to back off and really present that thematic unit in a way that students can discover.
The calendar is a very good way to show culture. Chinese too, we have a very different calendar. Traditional Chinese calendar is very different.
And then it gets away from the Chinese food restaurant, right? Where there's so many American cultures now built into, right? I mean, when it's not always authentic to go to a restaurant of a certain nationality in the United States, and they can see language beyond a food project, right? I mean, culture beyond a food or an arts and crafts project, right?
So what are you talking about? What are some of the points that you're making? How about at that back table?
So we were talking about culture general, and that students experience culture on so many different levels. They can experience their family culture and experience someone else's family culture. Then they're exposed to a variety of different cultures if they live in a big city, for instance. But the challenge is to express that in the target language.
Yes.
And for many instructors, I feel like the only resort is authentic materials. If you don't have that opportunity to bring in the native speakers or take your kids out of the classroom, then you have to deal with authentic materials and do your best.
And you have to bring those authentic materials into them through virtual means, perhaps. Yeah, but it's totally necessary to do. And what you're talking about, using the target language, I mean, we're presuming that everything is done in the target language. So you're not having the long English discussions with your English-speaking learners about culture. So how are you going to, if they have the opportunity to experience culture, be it small or large, how are they reflecting on it?
I think the way that probably within the STARTALK sort of setting that would be the most important part of culture is, and this is something that Hammerly was talking about in the 70s and 80s, and now Walker and Noda have been talking about more recently, is this whole notion of communicating in the culture or culture as performance. So the ways in which you behave, that you interact with native speakers of the language, and it's not just the stereotypical sort of things, it goes broader than that, but performative culture, the ways that you behave in culturally appropriate ways, are in many ways more important for our learners in the STARTALK program than being able to talk about, as you said, to talk about the great works of Tang painting or traditional Chinese music or whatever.
Right. But again, if they have those opportunities, how do they see that they're progressing? How do they begin to understand that they're growing in interculturality? Is it important that they understand this?
I think it's very easy to, as you've referenced, that big C and the little c. You know, we tend to fall back on the big C's. You know, they can do a report on food, or or a ritual,
Or the Great Wall or whatever.
Right, and we think that so if they can do that they somehow have gotten culture. And I agree with you that the classroom content itself, where they have to negotiate meaning with a different language speaker from a different country, will present many, many, many opportunities. Now, measuring that becomes very difficult, but it's really like norming students to any context, right? They have to figure out that teacher and how to operate in that classroom. And in the language classroom, that is innately cultural.
So what would make them recognize that they are progressing?
It's always been problematic about STARTALK because we are dealing with, as the phrase would be, you can't move the needle after only 2 weeks in terms of measuring progress. We can't give them an OPI. We can't give them a defense language proficiency test. So the quick and dirty one that I've had in my learning process was like when people stopped telling me that, oh, your Chinese is really, really good, and just started talking to me in the language, that was the self-assessment that I really needed. Now, that did not happen in 2 weeks of STARTALK or 4 weeks of STARTALK, but I think that should be in the back of our mind when we get our students to the point in which they're interacting with the native speaker doesn't say, as soon as they say ni hao, it's like, oh, your Chinese is wonderful. Well, probably isn't at that particular point, but...
I can't wait till we get behind hello.
Yeah,
Did you have something you wanted to add?
More or less the same. I would say it's through observation, especially STARTALK is so short. So probably through observation and you develop the awareness, and then you find, it's like a circle. You have to go through, you observe, and you develop the awareness, and then you use it through the perspectives and so forth. And
the self-awareness, that's very important. Yeah, developing that in the learners so they can monitor, because the 2 weeks that you get with them, they will not become proficient. The bulk of their, for any language, but particularly for less commonly taught, they're never going to get proficient even in the 2 or the 3 or the 4 years that you get them. It's going to be after they leave.
But if you've had none of that language, and you've had then 2 weeks of that language in a culturally rich environment, that's huge growth. We can't necessarily demonstrate it, but it's huge.
Just because it's not measurable doesn't mean that it's not valuable or important.
And we may be giving up the not measurable piece. If you think about, let's think about culture in a just English-only classroom. We measure students understanding the culture of that classroom through student engagement, through the types of questions that they ask, you know, by their interaction with their peers. So there are very specific ways we actually talk about classroom management or setting the culture of a classroom. And I think some of those are maybe not all, but some of those may be useful to start to have the conversations about what does it mean for a student to navigate culture in a bigger sense, you know, cross-cultural, transcultural understanding. They still have to be engaged. I mean, when people started talking to you, there was a different level of engagement, you know. They still have to be able to ask meaningful questions. And so there are ways that students demonstrate their understanding of classroom culture all the time. In this case, it's a rich sense of classroom culture.
And I see your observation concept of the assessment as being perfectly appropriate, but I'm a little bit more concerned with the students' understanding of how they're progressing. What do they think that they are learning? They need to be thinking about their learning so that will push them on toward more learning in the future.
We talked about role play as a way for letting them like use target language and also have an awareness that they're able to enact these cultural norms. And then, you know, I guess just throwing it out as an idea, then you could, if you want students to have this awareness that they have gotten this down, maybe it would be in the form of a role play that they do for others. Like maybe if the parents come to visit the program and they have to like host them for tea, or, you know, something like that that's interactive or probably doesn't require huge amounts of target language, but like it does give them this sense that they have a little bit of insider knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. We all know those performances at the end are one way that they show that their knowledge of language and culture, but I don't think they get as much out of that as they would of an experience like that, where they're using it with someone who may be a learner. You know, you learn more by teaching, and in the sense they're teaching at that point.
I think the emergence of the can-do sort of models that we've got, any one of a number of them are out there. The government has them. I know there's in other, those sorts of rubrics where the student can develop that sense of, I can do these. And even through ILR, we have self-assessments where you can sort of, in a very, it's not an authorized OPI test, but it gives a sense for a learner to say where I am on some other sort of objective sort of scale.
But that suggests sometime either during the program or after hours of the program for students to be able to self-assess. They need to reflect.
In the STARTALK, some of the STARTALK programs that are out there, regular part of the program is on a weekly basis or whatever. They have to do either a journal and or can do statements based upon what the content of the program is. And that's really, really valuable. That's what they're going to develop.
Yeah, and that should go beyond STARTALK programs. That should be in any classroom.
Look at the context here, what we're talking about. How can STARTALK promote that?
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me show you this in talking about performance. It's a third grade class. Once a year, they do this huge performance for the parents. Now that could be at the end of a STARTALK program as well. There are events like this. So how does this, or does it, demonstrate interculturality? To what extent is it intercultural? Yes, it is. Over here.
Well, we were talking about interculturality in context of language and using that language in the target culture. So here, this is not demonstrated. I'm not saying that the language is not present, but in this particular video, it's just not demonstrated.
Right. There's no use of the language. I'm not sure to what extent interpreting and listening comes in. Very little, I would suspect. But okay, what else?
Having been involved in these sorts of things in various settings over the years, and I always get a little bit uneasy whenever I see them because it's sort of like you're trotting them out for like a dog and pony show. And I increasingly, though, when I see it, I think the value in this lies, maybe it's not that it's not valuable for the students, but I think it's valuable for promoting interculturality in the audience. And I think ultimately that's the most important thing about it. It's not that we don't want to applaud them for what they're doing there, but it's the parents or the friends or the families that are watching this. That's where the interculturality, the consciousness at least of it, is beginning to be developed. I think that's actually the more important thing that goes on in these China nights or whatever they get called.
Right. And it's important to think that to understand that these kids are taking the role of the other.
Correct.
They're not negotiating
they're not
anything.
intercultural in a sense.
Yeah.
They're promoting interculturality, but they are putting themselves into that culture to hopefully heighten the awareness of the folks.
Exactly. But it suggests too that we need to get our teachers to think about this, to realize that this is not the end, that this is not the way that interculturality is always demonstrated. It is an aspect that plays into the growth of interculturality among all stakeholders, but this is not necessarily a demonstration of interculturality. It's a demonstration of culture.
I would think that the interculturality comes as they're preparing for it and teaching the students about the dance.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So we see the end result, but it was really what happened
The
in
process.
the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
The process is more relevant.
Yeah.
Right, as in most things, the process is more important. Okay, here's another. High school students. Again, oftentimes we link the music and the dance as part of the products or the practices of the culture, and they are demonstrating that. How intercultural is it?
I would assume the same comments apply that were just shared. There's not language, it's probably whatever went into it ahead of time.
Right. But again, it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing, but it's how it's used and it's what happens in that process. It's what the teacher does to guide the students in learning these aspects of culture and in reflecting on their learning. So it's what's not shown that's probably the intercultural part. Okay, now this is a student who is giving a speech.
فيها شطر زماني أنهال فيها علما وأحيا وعلم حياة على الحسين.
Okay, now she's talking about her school situation versus a school situation in looking at schools in an Arabic setting. This is a presentation for parents. There are a couple of native speakers in the audience because some of the students have parents who speak Arabic. But so where is this on that scale of interculturality? And those of you who know Arabic, perhaps you might give a little insight into the actual content and how that pertains to interculturality.
It doesn't reflect any culture. She's just using the language.
But the term Arab, being a quote-unquote Arab, is predicated on the language.
Sure.
So it may not be explicit, the cultural elements may not, be glaring and explicit, but the choice of words, the degree of formality, the register, and all that. These are all cultural elements, but they are kind of beneath the surface.
So again, probably it goes into preparation. It does come through because she is using the language and she's using her knowledge of that register and the formality and how it comes across. And there is an audience that she knows is going to be there that will understand her. So it's a little bit closer to interculturality. And certainly it's all valid and all valuable. Intercultural competencies have been described by two states in their standards, my state of Kentucky and also in South Carolina. We've created these together. They're can-do statements. They take into account Byram's theories, and you can see that in terms of investigation. The first competence is investigation of cultural products and practices. And this is pretty much what we all do. We identify, we look at what's there in the products, in the practices, just from a knowledge perspective. Then we begin to understand the cultural perspectives of how these things are underlying beliefs and values, how those products and practices are created by or create the thoughts and beliefs, and then how you participate with your knowledge in the actual cultural context, using the knowledge and language together. So under investigation, a novice benchmark might be the ability to identify the products and practices of a culture. And a learning indicator could be that you can identify some things that you do at home or within your community, or in the culture's community that are identified with the concept of culture. What is typical for behavior in the home or in the community to that culture, and to your own as well. Also, some learning targets then, more specific, might be identifying common eating habits, or what people wear for certain occasions, or expressing time and date, or greetings for holidays. So these would be things that you could set I can statements for to show some growth at that novice level. In the cultural perspectives, comparing beliefs and values. Well, that's a little nebulous and sounds a little high level, but can you describe some basic cultural viewpoints? And then the learning targets for that, you could talk about the role of a family member, or not even talk about it, but just identify the role through the language. And a lot of languages have different words for different groupings within the family to show authority. So thinking of that, the importance of the birth order. And then giving examples that show the importance of academics versus sports, perhaps, or other elements of culture. Describing the importance of education, and not in terms of describing in the novice. What's describing at the novice level? You can give simple sentences, but it's pretty limiting. But maybe you could, if you saw pictures of a school in the target culture and a school here, you could identify what the similarities and the differences were. That's the beginning. That's the beginning of a realization of cultural differences and similarities, which are important. Can you function at the survival level in an authentic cultural context? This gets into the interaction, the functioning, using the language, using the culture. What can you do at that survival level? Because at the novice level, that's all you are. So can you use memorized language and basic cultural knowledge to interact with others? Usually, appropriately, and we're thinking only in those contexts which are very familiar to you. So again, those greetings in the beginning levels. So for example, asking and answering simple questions, or making comments in terms of a family event or a social event with peers. Making a general cultural reference, being able to use the title of a song or refer to a famous person. And again, very limiting. Playing a game. And I would think in many of your programs that learners at the young level, even the teenagers, are playing a game or playing a sport that is played in the target culture, using some correct language. So they're showing the beginnings of interculturality. Okay, so when you're doing an activity that lends itself toward interculturality, questions to ask might be, to what extent does the encounter address appropriate, targeted proficiency sub-level? So in the case of when you're Skyping with another class, preparing those students ahead of time, having them create their questions with the knowledge of the language at that sub-level is important. not creating it, and making them recognize that they don't know enough vocabulary to ask questions about topics that they've never talked about. They may be of interest to them, and if they're of interest, perhaps they want to learn that vocabulary, but that awareness. So the sub-level of the language is important. And then providing the cultural knowledge and context. To what extent did this provide cultural knowledge and context? Well, there's a wealth of knowledge to be gained from it. It's what you do with the experience. I've seen lots of classes have Skyping activities, but it's to what extent does the teacher elicit information later from what the students have noticed and what they've been able to do. And then to what extent does it provide an opportunity for learners to use the target language?
So you said that a lot of the success of these types of encounters rests on the follow-up activity that the teacher does. But these questions here, are these questions that you would give to a teacher when they're planning the activity?
I would think yes, before and after, actually. You give it before, or you have, if you're noticing, it depends where you are in your program. I mean, obviously to prepare them, you'd give these ahead of time. But if you're in the middle of something and then you see an activity happens where there's some wasted opportunities, or it's a cultural activity that doesn't allow for much to happen, then I would give these and have them reflect on it.
Okay.
And then what about the resources too? What activities do you provide that allow the kids to interact with those authentic materials? Not just showing, but actually interacting with them. So, one more.
Élever une nouvelle génération d'Américains.
Выращивание нового поколения американцев.
Growing a new generation of Americans.
Eventually, and it depends on circumstances how quickly this happens, that cultural identity in a sense disappears or it becomes transparent, and you see in front of you the individual, and it becomes a personal interaction rather than a cultural interaction. And that no doubt is what happens with children, and they stop seeing them through their cultural identity and start seeing them as the individual. At a personal level, interacting personally.
So do you think the Skyping activity allows for that?
Yes and no.
Mm-hmm. How yes, how no?
I personally think Skyping brings in a lot of culture, because in our program when we use Skyping, we do a lot in school also, not in languages. There's a lot of learning, not only interculturally, there are other things also. So just like she's mentioned that this, in the process also, we are teaching kids this is what is going to happen, this is what the questions may be asked, so you can prepare for the questions. So there's a lot of preparation in there too. And when they are interacting, it might be, even though they are prepared, there might be a surprise element in there which they are not prepared, and how to deal with that surprise element and how to react there. So that's where they also learn culture a lot.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's helpful for you to prepare teachers in the STARTALK program with allowing them to experience some of that cultural opportunity, maybe among other teachers in the group, and then to reflect on it themselves, so that they would come to that same understanding. When the students are reacting in that video clip, I mean, you do see the typical girl giggle, looking at the cute guy and the guy's stance and, dealing. There's some of that there. And so they can go beyond the culture and just connect. But it's going to be a short period. Once the language comes into play and they can't go farther with it, then that's when they start to sense a retreat back into their own culture. So again, allowing them to figure those things out and to think about that, because that's motivation to learn the language too. All right, look at this and see if you can answer some of those questions that were posed before. To what extent does this experience allow students to engage in the authentic materials or use the language. This is Spanish.
You do it when you're not eating tortillas, okay? What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna call groups up by their table. Now, if you just take a look and you see the tables over there, the carpetas, sácate un bola. Bien. He has a folder. What color are you? Okay, a little bit odd. Put your hand on top. La mano. Ahora, espera. You have to have this even, otherwise it'll be uneven. Jasmine, número 6. Número 6. Okay. Ahora. What happens, I think, is if you put so many out here.
Yeah, it starts.
We're okay.
But look how patient they're being. I hope you did that right. No, you didn't.
The lever. There you go. Bien. Strong.
Fuerte, muy fuerte. Now look how big that turned.
Can you read número 3?
Okay. So, what's going on there that's helping or hindering interculturality from occurring? Yeah, look what happens when you exit from that target language. That code switching just ruins everything. It breaks the mood. It cracks the cultural context. It allows you to not enter into that other culture, but to always be yourself in your own culture. You're just making something to eat. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Use the tortilla press, which most of them probably
That's
don't
right.
have in their kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
It was tactile, it was interactive.
Right. So if they use the target language the whole time, it might be a pretty good activity. Because then you'd stay in the language all the time, you'd connect the language with the culture. Otherwise, you're just learning the culture. And when you take that back out of the classroom, what can you do? What can you do as a learner with the language and your knowledge of the culture? Not much with the language, yeah. You can say tortilla probably, but that's, Yeah, so both, and giving opportunities for the kids to use the language. Maybe to ask some questions, or they have to go through a process to tell what they're doing, or to ask, can I have the dough? Can I have the press? Whatever. Some activity that puts that language in the context of the culture and brings them forward a little bit. Okay, now this is just a typical art project. And we do lots of art projects in the STARTALK programs. So think about this. If, in this case, these are Spanish kids making a paper mache item. But think of what you do in your STARTALK programs in making art. Are you using the language with the culture? Are you creating a cultural artifact that is authentic? Because both of those things are needed. And what would be would it be appropriate to use vocabulary here in the target language? How could you do it to make it meaningful to the kids? What kind of vocabulary could you use that would be meaningful in this case?
Colors. The process of doing it.
Yeah. The process of doing it. Yes, the words that are the colors and the objects, but those action verbs, putting it into, the directions. Okay, so think about this. The teacher's role in getting us to interculturality. You got to give them the experiences. If they don't have the experiences, if they don't have the materials, they don't have the opportunities to interact with others, they won't advance. The second one. They've got to think about the products and the practices and then link them to the beliefs. It does take intentionally thinking about it. You can't just do a cultural activity. You've now got to intentionally think about linking the language and the culture and getting the kids to have a reflective process about it. It doesn't have to be long. It can be short, it can be a graphic organizer, but somehow they've got to think about what they're learning.
If you can go back,
Uh-huh.
in my experience in visiting various STARTALK programs, this planning process is time consuming. An intensive STARTALK 2 weeks program, I've seen the tendency among some programs to kind of skirt
The planning.
that planning element, which is actually
It's crucial, yeah.
So, I guess the awareness needs to be made that, it's not, it doesn't have to be an elaborate.
But the more planning you do intentionally up front, the easier it's going to be to carry through during the weeks of the program. Exactly. And that realizing that you're just building the foundation. But if you don't have that foundation, you can't grow. And it's your opportunity as STARTALK program people to actually start that foundation and build it solidly with the teachers understanding what the interculturality involves, that it is the language and the culture. So in planning the lesson, think about the target language, what your objectives are there, what the goals are you want students to be able to do, and then what culture do you want them to know, and then what kind of opportunities are you going to give them to experience the culture so that their interculturality can grow. Yes?
We are talking about integrating language and culture, but in STARTALK summer programs, we have a theme. It's a theme-based curriculum. So, for example, if we do yoga in the morning, and the theme is Indian architect or ancient Indian architect, how is yoga, cultural activity related, integrating with the theme?
Well, and that's part of that planning, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But if it isn't, then maybe you can find something else that would culturally integrate with the theme. It should be connected to the theme.
Yeah, so in the webinar I heard this is called separated by lunch. So you do an activity, cultural activity, which is totally not connected to the theme of your curriculum. But there are themes of how do you create...
If you're doing an architectural theme, I would certainly use buildings from the country where you're targeting the language.
Those are the projects they will be doing. As a final project, they will have a presentation, hands-on. But how is it reflecting the culture of the language? I mean, the theme-related culture, because language, culture, and theme, they all have to relate. So
the theme has what is its question? I mean, I would go back to what you want them to know and be able to do at the end. And around that topic or that theme, you have to intentionally think, if you're using yoga and then you're dealing with architecture, then I would find some architectural place where yoga is done traditionally and connect it. I mean, you have to make some kind of connection there. And they'll draw their own conclusions. I think we're about ending in time, so I'm going to skip through some pictures to get to some, and this will be up, I think, when you can see the resources, but also to go back to the session goals and ask you, just think about this, to what extent you can now define interculturality for your stakeholders. And can you recognize, and do you know how to actually plan with the alignment of the can-do statements for language with interculturality? And then can you plan some activities that are intercultural or lead kids to develop? And then thinking about how you assess or how you have them demonstrate and document. And that goes back to that reflection. Any questions last minute? Because we got to end up.
I had a question. I was particularly interested as one of the line in the description of this was how to use technology in producing all that. How would you suggest how to use technology to bring in all these things together, the intercultural and everything? How would you put it? What are the different strategies that you would use?
Well, and I'll ask some of you to give some examples too, but obviously the Skyping, because you get the real time, but blogging back and forth, posting blogs. Using tweets today, I mean, it's done all over, and kids do it more than adults do, I think. But I think the tweet lends itself to short usage of language and can even be done with novice learners. But trying to find connections, and through those partnership resources, trying to link up with someone who's a native speaker on a peer level. Depends on your age, of course. But if you're doing technology, there's also some of the new learning sites that offer some games for technology too, for learning the language, and that's an activity that can be a kind of a restful activity in between the learning sessions. What have you found technologically?
Well, I will mention just the videos that have been shown, because I think we have a teacher training program. You have to kind of hit this because if they're working in American schools, they're going to run into cultural issues all over the place. Right? So the video clips that have been shown are from Global Villages. We actually did this video, and it's available.
The Michael Byram.
Yeah, it's about 20 minutes long, but it has teachers talking about their challenges around cross-cultural understanding, and then parents talking about their challenges of having their children in immersion programs. So part of this is also getting the adults out of it. So that's a resource that you can have. It's just Global Village Academies. It's on the StarTalk website.
Thanks for sharing. Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope this is helpful for you.